It had been 3 weeks since I was assigned to Blackridge State Penitentiary when Caleb Monroe arrived. Just another inmate convicted of armed robbery. Young, arrogant, the type who hadn't yet grasped the weight of time behind bars. But that day, with the cold cutting through the spine and fog covering the cracked concrete yards, I felt that discomfort in the air, the kind of feeling I've learned to respect over the years in this job. The prison was old, forgotten by almost everyone. Blackridge was the kind of place where sounds echoed differently, as if each wall held a secret no one dared to tell. And one of those secrets lived in the cafeteria. I was the one who escorted Monroe to his cell. He tried to make conversation, but my mind was elsewhere. As we passed the corridor leading to the cafeteria, he mentioned something about the strange smell coming from there. I stopped for a second and said, without looking at him, "You get used to it. Just avoid being alone in that place." He laughed. "Most do, until they hear the stories." The week before, one of the inmates, Miller, convicted of homicide, had a breakdown during dinner. He attacked another prisoner with a tray, screaming that the faces on the walls were watching him. I was one of the ones who had to restrain him. The look in his eyes, it wasn't rage. It was pure panic. Another guard, Simmons, swore he had seen the same Miller talking to himself in the corner of the cafeteria days earlier, whispering softly, eyes fixed on a dark spot on the ceiling. They said it was just guilt or the weight of conscience. But Simmons spoke to me after that day, pulled me aside in the locker room, lowered his voice and said, "It's not just him. Others see it too. And every time it happens, someone ends up in solitary. Or in a body bag." I didn't believe it. Didn't want to. But that night, lying in my quarters, I heard dragging footsteps coming from the yard that leads straight to the cafeteria. No one was scheduled to be there. Caleb didn't know it yet, but he was about to find out why nobody here jokes about that damn cafeteria. The cafeteria at Blackridge Penitentiary wasn't structurally different from those in other prisons. Long steel tables, chairs bolted to the floor, and lighting far too cold for comfort. But there, the unease didn't come from the architecture, it came from the men's behavior. Caleb Monroe was observant from the start. He watched in silence, chewed slowly, and rarely touched all of his food. As the days passed, he grew more reserved. His eyes scanned the room as if searching for something others seemed to avoid. For an outsider like me, the pattern was clear. Inmates always sat in the same spots, forming invisible territories. There were no loud conversations, no laughter or teasing. That wasn't a place for socializing. It was a field of restrained tension. The kind of silence that doesn't stem from immediate fear, but from respect for something unseen and older than everyone there. The cause of that silence wasn't obvious, but the effect was. Hungry inmates left food on their plates. Some ate too quickly, as if every second in there was too risky to waste. Others, the older ones, avoided looking toward a specific corner of the room, where peeling paint revealed dark, ancient marks on the concrete. No incident occurred during that shift, but the air was thick, as if something was always on the verge of happening. Blackridge held many stories, but none as constant and unspoken as the one that lingered over the cafeteria. It was as if everyone knew, without ever saying it, that place demanded silence. Among the Blackridge staff, there were certain conversations that didn't happen over radios or in the hallways. Stories whispered during shift breaks, behind the locked doors of the dormitories. The most repeated one involved a riot decades ago in the same cafeteria where silence now reigned. In the 1970s, the prison went through a severe food crisis. Budget cuts, government neglect, and poor management led to a disastrous chain of events. The food became unfit for consumption, yet it was served for weeks. Some inmates got sick, others died. The situation escalated into a violent riot during a nighttime meal. Internal accounts tell of a group of inmates who stormed the kitchen and used knives to attack guards and fellow prisoners. The cafeteria became a war zone, with bodies strewn between overturned tables and chairs. There are no precise official records of how many died. The numbers were suppressed, inconsistent. But those who worked there say blood ran through the drains for days. After the massacre, the cafeteria was closed for a while. When it reopened, the first reports of strange behavior began to surface. Guards avoided night shifts. New inmates showed discomfort without knowing why. And the older ones, they simply ate in silence. What happened that night left marks that couldn't be cleaned with bleach or covered with fresh paint. The walls absorbed it all, the screams, the blood, the despair. And even today, many believe the cafeteria demands respect. Not out of superstition, but because pain, when deep enough, lingers in the air. It wasn't just a story. It was a silent reminder that in that place, eating in silence was more than a rule. It was a survival instinct. Prison routine rarely changed. Scheduled hours, muffled voices, shuffling footsteps on concrete. But that week, something broke the cycle. One of the newer inmates, known to the guards only as G. Carter, began acting differently. He was impulsive, insolent, not yet wise to the silent signals Blackridge sends. During lunch, Carter deliberately threw his tray on the floor. He laughed loudly, mocked the food, and provoked other inmates. The sound of the tray echoed like thunder through the cafeteria, followed by a silence even denser than usual. No one reacted. Not the prisoners, not the staff. It was as if everyone froze. When 2 officers removed him from the cafeteria, no one commented. No formal reprimand was given. Just the collective, silent stare of those who knew something had been disrespected. The next morning, Carter didn't show up for roll call. The cell was locked from the inside, empty. No signs of escape or struggle. Just a dented mattress and a damp smell that felt stronger than usual. Searches were conducted. They combed through sewers, records, cameras. Nothing. No footage of him leaving the block. No noise captured by the mics. Carter simply vanished. What disturbed people most wasn't the lack of answers, but how everyone, inmates and veteran staff, reacted, with a silence that mixed acceptance with relief, as if Carter's absence had restored an invisible balance. From that day on, Caleb began eating more slowly. His eyes no longer looked for company, but for the nearest exits. He was beginning to understand that, in Blackridge, disappearance was less surprising than staying. After Carter vanished, the cafeteria seemed to sink into an even thicker silence. Meals continued at the same times, in the same numbed rhythm. But something had shifted. A new weight in the air. A collective sense that something had been fed. Caleb, already cautious, started avoiding the cafeteria whenever possible. He traded portions with other inmates, skipped meals, pretended to be sick. But the prison wasn't built to let anyone avoid certain places for long. Eventually, everyone had to eat. And he knew it would be too risky to draw attention by dodging it. That night, Caleb made a decision. He did what he never should have. Hid in the kitchen's locker room during the last shift. Not to prove a theory, but out of sheer restlessness. He wanted to understand why everyone accepted that fear without question. The place, dark and devoid of natural light, breathed humidity and rust. He stayed still for hours until the clock showed just past 3 a.m. Then he heard footsteps, not many, just 1 or 2 pairs, slow, as if whoever was walking was dragging something. He peeked through a crack and saw 2 inmates from the most isolated block enter the cafeteria. Silent men who barely interacted with others. They placed 2 trays on a table and sat in front of them without touching the food. For long minutes they remained there, motionless, staring at the plates. Time stretched like rubber, and Caleb began to notice the men didn't blink. When they finally got up, they took the trays back without having touched anything. One chair, however, remained slightly pulled out, as if someone were still sitting there. What he saw wasn't an apparition. There were no shadows, screams, or creaks. Just gestures that made no sense. A silent ritual, repeated like something learned. A behavior beyond logic, but perfectly aligned with the prison's atmosphere. Caleb walked out paler than he entered. He hadn't seen ghosts, he'd seen faith. A faith built on fear, sustained by repetition and disappearance. And that, perhaps, was more terrifying than anything supernatural. In the days following his silent vigil in the cafeteria, Caleb changed. There wasn't a sudden transformation, but a gradual wear that spread across his face, his gestures, his breathing. He no longer spoke to anyone. Spent most of his time staring at the floor of his cell, as if there was something there only he could see. Carter's absence was never officially recorded as a disappearance. On paper, it read as a transfer to disciplinary isolation, a procedure common enough not to raise suspicion. But among the inmates, his name stopped being mentioned. It was as if he had ceased to exist. Caleb, in silence, began mimicking the behavior of the older inmates. He started eating everything, even when the food was inedible. He never left leftovers, never made noise. And every night, he carefully folded his blanket and placed it on the bed, as if preparing to be removed at any moment. One night after dinner, he left an apple on a cafeteria table. No one stopped him. No one said a word. The fruit remained there, untouched, until the next morning, when it disappeared before breakfast was served. Days later, another inmate from Caleb's block was found hanged in his cell. He was one of the few who still mocked the stories, laughed loudly, and refused to follow the silent rituals. The investigation was brief, inconclusive, just another number in the system. After that incident, Caleb was transferred to a psychological observation unit. The official reason was withdrawn behavior and risk of mental collapse. But the truth, according to other guards, was different. He had become too stable, too obedient, as if nothing inside him remained to rebel. Months later, I was transferred out of Blackridge. I never saw Caleb again. But to this day, whenever I enter a cafeteria in any institution, I pay attention to the silence. I listen to the way utensils clink, how eyes avoid each other. I look for rituals, repeated little gestures, because I learned in that place that fear doesn't need ghosts. Sometimes all it takes is a room where people disappear, and no one asks why. And the scariest part is that, over time, you get used to it. Working on death row requires a different kind of discipline, not just because of the rules, but because of the silence. A heavy, dense silence that clings to the walls like mold. The routine never changes. Watch, feed, wait. And yet, it's in the middle of that monotonous cycle that the strangest things happen. Avery Blake arrived at the prison 3 years before his execution, convicted of triple homicide with irrefutable evidence. His story was well known, a cold-blooded massacre committed in a small town in rural Maine. But what drew the most attention wasn't the crime itself, but his reaction. From arrest to trial, Avery never defended himself, never got angry, never asked for anything. His expression remained the same, too calm. On the row, Avery stood out by his absence of everything. He didn't read, didn't write, didn't speak to other inmates, never made any special requests. He ate his meals with the same indifference, as if unaware of what he was chewing. Other guards said he had died inside long before he was sentenced, but something about him was unsettling. There was a look, direct, steady, that pierced through the bars as if they weren't there. There was no hate, no fear, no remorse. Just presence, total, intense, as if he knew exactly what was coming, as if he had been waiting for it. And maybe, deep down, he really had. On the eve of their execution, inmates are entitled to a last meal and, if they wish, may record a message. Most record words of regret or apologies to family. Others choose to remain silent. Avery, as expected, made no special meal request. But he surprised everyone by requesting to record a message. The request was made formally, in writing, with no additional details. When the time came, Avery sat in front of the recorder in the observation room. There was no audience, just the camera rolling and the technician's voice marking the start of the session. He began speaking in a calm, steady tone. He didn't hesitate, didn't seem to be reading. His speech was clean, precise, but the content, unsettling. Instead of addressing relatives or discussing his crime, he listed names, one by one. Some were family members, others completely unknown. Alongside the names, he mentioned specific dates, numbers, and fragments of disjointed phrases. There was no narrative, no emotion, just a methodical sequence, almost mechanical, as if reciting a formula. When he finished, he stared at the camera for a few seconds before the recording ended. No final words, no explanation. The recording was filed in the system like all the others. No one paid much attention to the content. It seemed meaningless, and Avery never gave any indication that he wanted to explain. To all appearances, it was just another bizarre moment at the end of a cold, silent man's path. But it wasn't. Avery Blake's execution was uneventful. No resistance, no reactions. The body was removed, and the cell stood empty. With him, it was believed, went just another name soon to be erased by time. But a few days later, something began to unsettle. One of the guards, Louis Turner, didn't show up for his shift. The news spread quickly. Turner had been found dead in his apartment, apparently of a heart attack. No signs of struggle or foul play. Just another body, another medical report, another coincidence. But a disturbing detail came up by chance. An administrative officer, who handled the archiving of final recordings, remembered that the name Turner had been mentioned by Avery in his message. No one gave it much thought at first. It was a common name. But in the days that followed, another name surfaced. This time, a medical wing staff member, Reggie Halbrook, requested an immediate transfer after a breakdown. He kept repeating that something was being followed exactly. In the psychiatric ward where he was admitted, he murmured that his name had also been mentioned in Avery's recording. That's when the video started quietly circulating among the older staff. Some watched it carefully for the first time. The list of names was there, one by one. Turner, Halbrook, and 3 others still alive. But the doubt was growing. It was no longer just about what Avery had said. It was about what hadn't happened yet. And who, among them, would be next in the sequence. Avery's video became whispered gossip in the hallways between shifts and in the security rooms, but no one openly admitted to being afraid of it. It was like a slow-acting poison. No one wanted to believe it, but no one could ignore it either. The most disturbing part was the sequence. Not just the names, but the order in which events were unfolding. The guard narrating this story, until then a skeptic, decided to watch the recording alone. He wanted to end it, debunk it once and for all. But upon reviewing the footage, his conviction began to crack. Among the names Avery recited, spaced without context, like a rosary muttered under breath, his own was there. Not as a whisper lost in the chaos, but spoken clearly. Between 2 already confirmed, Turner and Halbrook. The impact was physical. Cold sweat, trembling hands. A name recorded before the events, without explanation. And now, with his own life marked as part of the sequence, reality began to close in. He tried to rationalize coincidence, manipulation, maybe a psychological game crafted by Avery. But something didn't add up. He tried reporting it to his superiors, got no response. Those who knew stayed silent. Some wouldn't even meet his eyes, as if isolation were a form of protection. The prison, once familiar, now felt like a maze where every step was a reminder that time wasn't moving forward. It was counting down to something inevitable. Nights became longer. Every hallway sound, every system log, every prolonged silence between shifts carried a muted tension. He no longer slept well. No longer ate with the same appetite. his name was on the list, and no one else seemed willing to help him understand why. The obsession with the recording grew. The guards started watching it repeatedly, searching for flaws, distortions, any sign of manipulation. Nothing changed. Avery Blake always appeared the same, calm, unshaken, repeating names as if reading from a document only he could see. Time seemed frozen in that sequence, and the more he watched, the more he noticed subtle details previously missed. A slight pause between names, a hardened glance just before saying the names of those who hadn't yet been reached. Consumed by urgency, he tried to delete the file from the internal system, but discovered there wasn't just one copy. Staff had duplicated and saved the video on personal devices. In secret, it was even circulating among some inmates, treated as a dark curiosity. It was too late. Avery's message had spread like a virus, silent but persistent. The changes in the environment became visible. Guards requesting leave. Supervisors avoiding death row shifts. The routine was now marked by unexplained absences, diverted gazes, and a shared sense that something was slipping beyond control. But no one dared name it. In his final attempt, the guard left a letter with the security department. It wasn't a cry for help, nor a confession. Just a partial transcript of the names from the recording with a few dates written beside them. At the end, he wrote one single sentence. "If you're still reading this, don't look for explanation. Accept the rhythm." Days later, his rest cell was found empty. No signs of struggle, no record of exit. Just the office chair slightly turned toward the computer screen, where Avery's video was playing on loop. At the exact moment of his absence, Avery spoke the final line of the recording. "You always knew." It was only a matter of time. Declan Moore wasn't a name that caused trouble. Since his arrival at Fairhill State Penitentiary, his behavior had been considered exemplary. No history of aggression, respectful with the guards, quiet with the other inmates. He was the kind of prisoner who disappears into routine, discreet, methodical, predictable. That's why what happened that Tuesday morning came as such a shock. At 8:42 a.m., during breakfast in Wing B's cafeteria, Moore suddenly stood up, threw his tray to the floor, and launched himself at another inmate without any visible provocation. The attack was brutal, violent, irrational. It took 3 guards to restrain him, and even while restrained, he kept trying to bite his own arm, eyes wide open, breathing erratic as if he were somewhere else entirely. The assaulted inmate suffered only minor injuries, but the collective shock was massive. Not just because of the act, but because of who committed it. Moore was taken to solitary, where he spent the next hours in complete silence. When questioned, he said he didn't remember a thing, not a fragment. Just the memory of sitting down to eat, and then darkness. The administration filed the case as an isolated episode, a term used when they don't know what else to write, but there was something about that attack that didn't fit. The force used, the unprovoked fury, the emptiness in his eyes. In the days that followed, Declan Moore's name was no longer just another one. It started appearing in reports, backstage conversations, and clinical sessions. And Wing B's cafeteria, once mundane, would become the central piece in a sequence no one wanted to investigate too closely. The incident with Declan Moore seemed to be contained. After a period in isolation, he returned to his routine with the same previous posture. Quiet, cooperative, distant. Initial psychiatric evaluations showed no signs of disorder, just a single episode of dissociation, perhaps triggered by internal stress. But what happened in the following weeks shattered any theory of coincidence. Exactly 7 days later, at the same time and in the same spot of the cafeteria, Moore had another episode. He suddenly stood and attacked a different inmate, this time using a spoon as an improvised weapon. The pattern repeated. No provocation, direct attack, physical loss of control, and complete memory blackout afterward. The administration began adopting preventive measures, such as spacing between tables and increasing the number of guards during meals. Moore was isolated again. He showed no signs of remorse or denial, just confusion. He seemed as eager for answers as everyone else. At the third occurrence, at the same time, under direct surveillance, Moore didn't attack anyone. Instead, he had a different kind of breakdown. He screamed. A scream so raw it made other inmates recoil. A sound more animal than human, coming from a man who had never even raised his voice before. The pattern was clear, always Tuesdays. Always in Wing B's cafeteria, and increasingly violent. It wasn't just disruptive behavior. It was something rooted, like an expanding cycle. And the more they tried to understand, the more it became evident that Declan Moore wasn't the problem. He was the symptom. With no diagnosis and recurring episodes, the administration called for outside support. That's how forensic psychologist Thomas Greaves was brought onto Declan Moore's case. Greaves was known for his objective approach. Not fond of vague interpretations or esoteric theories, he treated behavioral disorders through patterns, trauma, and defense mechanisms. But what he found at Fairhill didn't fit into any category. The first sessions with Moore were conducted under observation, without direct contact. The inmate showed lucidity. He answered questions clearly, seemed perfectly aware of what was happening, except during the blackout moments. He described them as a sudden shut-off. No anxiety signs, no voices, no memories. Just the silence before and the darkness after. Greaves requested footage from the cafeteria's security system. He analyzed the recordings from the days of the incidents carefully. That's when he noticed an almost imperceptible pattern. Seconds before each episode, Moore would lock his eyes on a specific spot on the wall near the third window. It wasn't a casual glance. It was fixed, prolonged, like he was listening to something coming from there. Even more unsettling was the behavior of those around him. During the moments Moore froze, other inmates also seemed to slow down slightly, as if the entire environment's dynamic shifted. Hard to quantify, impossible to prove. Greaves took note of everything, but said nothing, not yet. He didn't know what was happening with Declan Moore, but he knew it wasn't an individual disorder. It was collective, environmental, and it was far from over. Increasingly uneasy with the lack of answers, Thomas Greaves broadened his investigation. He requested access to the prison's physical archives, old records, incident reports, medical and administrative transfers from years past. What he sought wasn't a diagnosis, but a precedent. Buried in a metal cabinet among yellowed papers and deteriorating folders, he found what seemed to be a forgotten pattern. Records of aggressive behavior in other inmates, with dates and times suspiciously similar to Moore's. In at least 4 documented cases, prisoners had snapped inside Wing B's cafeteria, always during Tuesday morning shifts. All were filed as isolated episodes. None continued, because all involved inmates were transferred, medicated, or, in 2 cases, found dead in their cells. Greaves began cross-referencing dates, profiles, routines. No direct connection among the inmates. Different crimes, varied ages, no shared background. But the common thread was clear. Wing B cafeteria, fixed schedule, loss of control, lack of memory. Even more disturbing was the content of a report written by a former prison psychologist, dated 1996. The professional described a seemingly sensory stimulus cycle, triggered by repeated exposure to the same environment. He recommended the temporary closure of the area for investigation. The request was denied. The psychologist was dismissed weeks later. Greaves didn't tell the administration. He knew that, in that institution, some reports weren't forgotten. They were buried on purpose. Institutional silence was a language of its own, and he was starting to understand it. The question was no longer whether Declan Moore was repeating a pattern. It was whether he would be the last, and whether what was affecting him was just beginning to stir again. Thomas Greaves knew he had crossed a line. His job was clinical, not investigative. But when he made an informal request to visit Wingby's cafeteria outside operating hours, no one stopped him. Perhaps because they didn't take his claims seriously. Or maybe because they already knew and preferred to let him see for himself. On a Saturday morning, the cafeteria was empty, except for a bored guard by the entrance. Cold lighting, fixed chairs, stacked trays. Everything looked like any other prison cafeteria. But there was something in the acoustics, something that made sound seem muffled, like the air resisted any noise. Greaves walked slowly to the third window, the same spot Moore stared at before each episode. There was nothing there, just poorly painted concrete and a damp corner. But staying there long enough, he began to feel slight pressure on his temples, like entering a pressurized room or ascending a mountain quickly. A humming, perhaps, or just suggestion, but it was there. In the following days, he began to experience difficulty sleeping. Brief memory lapses, like forgetting where he left objects or what he had just said minutes earlier. Small glitches, small voids. Reluctantly, he wrote a full report and handed it directly to the administration. The document was never answered. 2 days later, Thomas Greaves didn't show up for work. His car was found in the prison parking lot. Key in the ignition, door open, engine cold. Inside Moore's cell, an untouched food tray. On the wall, written in mashed potatoes, a single word: repetition. If you've ever gone through something similar, or know someone who has, leave a comment below. Sometimes just telling it is already a way to protect yourself. And if this video made you think twice before letting your guard down, then it was already worth it. Here, we don't tell stories to entertain. We tell them to warn, because real fear doesn't jump scare you. It silences. It freezes. And if you want to keep hearing stories that might help keep you alive, subscribe. The next story could be yours.